No one would give the eulogy at my cruel grandmother's funeral, so I volunteered and told a beautiful fake story about her. After the service, her lawyer approached me with a smile. "Congratulations," he said. "You just passed her final test." Before the story, let's do this. Comment your age and be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories every day. Now, let's head back to that awkward funeral parlor. I was sitting in the front row of Willow Creek Memorial Chapel, watching my family squirm in their seats like children who'd been called to the principal's office. We were all there for the same reason, to bury my grandmother, Beatrice Montgomery. But none of us wanted to be there, and we certainly didn't want to pretend we were sad about it. Beatrice Montgomery had died at 86, and if I'm being completely honest, most of the family was relieved. She had been, by any measure, a difficult woman, not just difficult, cruel. For as long as I could remember, she had wielded her wealth and sharp tongue like weapons, cutting down anyone who dared to disappoint her, which was pretty much everyone. I'm 31 years old, a social worker at the County Children's Services Department, and I had always been what you might call the forgotten granddaughter. While my cousins competed for Grandma Beatrice's attention and approval, and more importantly, her money, I had kept my distance. Not because I was above the family drama, but because I had learned early on that getting close to Beatrice Montgomery meant getting hurt. She had a gift for finding your weakest spot and pressing on it until you broke. My cousin Marcus, who had struggled with stuttering as a child, still spoke in barely audible whispers at family gatherings because of the harsh corrections she used to make. My cousin Isabella had given up her dream of becoming a veterinarian after Beatrice spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner explaining why women who preferred animals to people were clearly damaged goods. My younger sister, Jasmine, had developed an eating disorder in high school, partially triggered by Beatrice's constant commentary about her thunder thighs and unfortunate bone structure. But here's the thing about Beatrice: she wasn't just randomly cruel. She was strategically cruel. She would dangle the promise of inheritance like a carrot, making it clear that her considerable fortune would go to whoever pleased her most. This had turned family gatherings into gladiatorial contests, with siblings and cousins competing to see who could earn her favor while simultaneously sabotaging each other's efforts. I had opted out of that game years ago. While everyone else was performing for her approval, I had simply visited. Not often, maybe once every few months, but I would stop by her massive Victorian mansion on Magnolia Avenue, sit in her formal parlor with its intimidating antique furniture, and listen to her complain about the family, the neighbors, the state of the world, and whatever unlucky service person had most recently failed to meet her impossible standards. I wasn't trying to win her over. I didn't agree with her harsh judgments or laugh at her cruel observations. I just listened. Sometimes I pushed back gently, offering different perspectives on her complaints. Other times I just sat there, letting her words wash over me while I studied the elaborate crown molding or counted the roses in the ancient wallpaper pattern. She had said to me once, after a particularly long rant about how my cousin Tyler's new girlfriend was obviously a gold digger with questionable breeding, that I was the only one who doesn't want anything from me. I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an accusation, but something in her voice made me think it might have been both. Now she was gone, found peacefully in her sleep by her longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who had worked for the family for over 2 decades and was probably the only person who genuinely mourned Beatrice's passing. We were all gathered in this sterile funeral home, with its generic floral arrangements and soft instrumental music, staring at a casket surrounded by flowers that no one had sent out of love. The funeral director, a nervous man named Mr. Richardson with thinning hair and perpetually damp palms, had been trying for 20 minutes to find someone willing to give the eulogy. "Surely someone would like to share some memories of Mrs. Montgomery?" he asked, his voice getting more desperate with each repetition. "A favorite story? A lesson she taught you? The impact she had on your life?" The silence was deafening. My Uncle Harrison, Beatrice's eldest son and the family's unofficial patriarch, was studying his expensive Italian leather shoes with intense concentration. My Aunt Patricia was checking her phone with the focused attention of someone performing brain surgery. My cousins were all suddenly fascinated by various architectural features of the funeral home. The ceiling, the carpet, the elaborate floral arrangements that nobody had actually chosen with care. "Anyone?" Mr. Richardson tried again, a note of pleading creeping into his professional composure. "Perhaps a favorite memory? a tradition she upheld, something that made her special. More silence. You could practically hear the collective holding of breath. I could see people in the small congregation, mostly elderly neighbors from the exclusive Magnolia Avenue area, a few people from her country club, and some representatives from the various charitable organizations she had supported more for tax purposes than genuine altruism, beginning to whisper among themselves. This was becoming embarrassing in a way that would have infuriated Beatrice more than any individual slight. She was a very strong woman, my Uncle Harrison finally offered weakly, the words coming out like he was confessing to a crime. Strong-willed, my Aunt Patricia corrected, and even that felt like she was being extraordinarily generous. Independent, added my cousin Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. These pathetic offerings hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Mr. Richardson looked around the room with growing panic. In 30 years of conducting funerals, he had probably never encountered a situation where literally no one wanted to say anything genuinely positive about the deceased. The awkwardness was becoming palpable, spreading through the room like a physical presence. That's when I stood up. "I'll do it," I said. Every head in the room turned to look at me with expressions ranging from surprise to concern to barely concealed horror. My Uncle Harrison's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his receding hairline. My cousin Isabella actually looked worried, as if I might be having some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by grief or guilt. My sister Jasmine mouthed, "What are you doing?" with a look of genuine alarm. "Elena," my Aunt Patricia whispered urgently, "you don't have to do this." "It's fine," I said, walking toward the podium with more confidence than I felt. "Someone should say something." As I stood behind the lectern, looking out at the small crowd of people who had come to see Beatrice Montgomery buried, I realized I had absolutely no idea what I was going to say. The faces staring back at me were a mixture of curiosity, concern, and barely concealed anticipation for what promised to be either a disaster or a miracle. I couldn't tell the truth, that she'd been a bitter, manipulative woman who had made most of our lives miserable through calculated cruelty and emotional manipulation. That she'd pitted family members against each other for sport, crushing dreams and confidence with equal efficiency. That most of us were here out of obligation rather than grief, and that her death felt more like the end of a long, exhausting siege than the loss of a beloved matriarch. But I also couldn't just stand there in silence, allowing this woman's life to end without anyone speaking for her, even if what I spoke was fiction. So I did something I had never done before in my life, something that went against every principle I'd developed as a social worker trained to value honesty and authentic communication. I lied. Completely, thoroughly, and with absolute conviction. My grandmother, Beatrice Montgomery, was a woman who taught me that love comes in many different forms. I began, my voice surprisingly steady. I saw my cousin Isabella's eyes widen in surprise. Love, from Grandma Beatrice, the woman who had once told Isabella that her decision to become a nurse meant she was clearly comfortable settling for mediocrity. When I was young, I continued, weaving fiction from thin air, she would invite me into her garden on Sunday afternoons. She would teach me the names of all her flowers, explaining how each variety required different care, different attention. She had a special touch with roses. Her garden was legendary in the neighborhood. This was completely false. Beatrice had employed a team of professional gardeners and had never shown any personal interest in horticulture beyond criticizing their work. I wasn't even sure she could distinguish a rose from a daisy. She would tell me stories about her childhood during the war years, about how her family always found ways to help their neighbors who had even less. She taught me that true prosperity wasn't about what you accumulated, but what you shared with others. Another complete fabrication. Beatrice had grown up in considerable privilege and had spent her adult life accumulating wealth and status symbols while showing minimal interest in genuine charitable work beyond the tax-advantageous donations that enhanced her social standing. She taught me that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, I said, looking directly at my Uncle Harrison, who had spent years trying to shout over his mother's criticisms and had never quite succeeded. It's about being the person others can count on when everything falls apart. I was making this up as I went along, pulling inspiration from the kind of grandmother I wished I'd had rather than the one I'd actually known. But something strange was happening. As I spoke, I could see people in the congregation beginning to nod. Some of the elderly neighbors were wiping their eyes. Even my own family members were looking moved by this fictional version of Beatrice Montgomery. She had a way of seeing potential in people that they couldn't see in themselves. I continued, the lies flowing more easily now. She would challenge you, yes, but only because she believed you were capable of more than you thought possible. She never accepted mediocrity, not because she was cruel, but because she knew that accepting less than your best was a form of self-betrayal. This was perhaps the biggest lie of all. Beatrice's challenges had always felt more like emotional warfare than encouragement. Her refusal to accept mediocrity had manifested as a systematic destruction of anyone who failed to meet her impossibly high standards, delivered with a surgical precision that left lasting scars. I remember the last conversation I had with her, I said, surprised by how easily this fiction was emerging. She told me that the most important thing in life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave away. She said that kindness was the only currency that truly mattered, and that the richest people were the ones who made others feel valued and seen. The irony of attributing these words to Beatrice Montgomery, a woman who had hoarded both money and affection like a dragon guarding treasure, who had made people feel small and inadequate as a form of entertainment, was not lost on me. But as I looked out at the faces in the congregation, I could see that my words were having an effect. People were leaning forward, engaged in a way they hadn't been since we'd arrived. My grandmother wasn't always easy to understand, I said, and this, finally, was absolutely true. She had high standards, and she didn't suffer fools gladly. But underneath that tough exterior was a woman who cared deeply about her family and her community. She believed that love sometimes meant holding people accountable, even when it was uncomfortable. I paused, looking down at the casket where Beatrice lay in her best navy dress, the one she'd worn to important social functions, the one that had made her look formidable and elegant in equal measure. She was probably rolling over in that very dress at the saintly portrait I was painting of her. She taught me that sometimes the people who are hardest to love are the ones who need love the most, I concluded, my voice growing stronger with each word. And that true character is revealed not in how we treat those who can help us, but in how we treat those who can't. She showed me that dignity isn't something you're born with, it's something you choose every day, regardless of how others treat you. I stepped back from the podium to a round of applause that felt surreal. People were actually clapping for a eulogy about Beatrice Montgomery. My Aunt Patricia was crying, genuine tears that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone else. My cousin Marcus was nodding approvingly, as if he was remembering a completely different grandmother than the one who had made him afraid to speak above a whisper. Even the funeral director looked relieved, as if I had somehow salvaged what had promised to be a complete disaster. As I returned to my seat, I felt a complicated mixture of guilt, satisfaction, and something that might have been grief. I had lied through my teeth about a woman who had caused real pain to people I loved, but I had also given Beatrice a dignity in death that she had rarely shown in life. I had created a version of her that people could mourn, even if that version had never actually existed. My sister Jasmine reached over and squeezed my hand. "That was beautiful, Elena," she whispered. "I almost forgot who we were talking about." The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns that Beatrice probably never hummed, prayers about mercy and forgiveness that she rarely practiced, and readings about love and redemption that seemed to describe someone else entirely. We watched as her casket was carried out by pallbearers, who were probably the only people in the room being paid to be there, their faces professionally solemn as they navigated the awkward choreography of death. At the graveside, as we watched Beatrice Montgomery being lowered into the ground next to her husband of 40 years, a man who had died when I was in college, possibly from the relief of escaping her constant criticism, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not because I was sad to see her go, but because I had managed to give her something she had never given anyone else: the benefit of the doubt. The cemetery was beautiful in the way that expensive cemeteries always are, with manicured lawns and tasteful monuments that spoke of money and status even in death. Beatrice would have approved of the location, I thought. She had always been conscious of appearances, always aware of how things looked to others. As the minister spoke about eternal rest and divine mercy, I found myself thinking about the woman in the casket. Had she ever been truly happy? Had there been moments of joy in her life that she had kept hidden from us? Or had bitterness and disappointment consumed so much of her that there had been no room for anything else? After the burial, as people began to disperse with the awkward efficiency of those who had fulfilled an obligation, a man in an expensive charcoal suit approached me. He was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. His handshake was firm, his smile practiced but not entirely insincere. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm Richard Pemberton, your grandmother's attorney." "Oh," I said, shaking his hand and trying to place him among the people I'd seen at family gatherings over the years. "Nice to meet you." "That was a beautiful eulogy," he said, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, something that seemed both genuine and calculating. Very creative. I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. "Thank you, I just thought someone should say something nice about her." "Indeed," Mr. Pemberton said, his smile growing wider. "In fact, I was hoping we could speak privately. There are some matters regarding your grandmother's estate that I need to discuss with you." "With me?" I was confused. "I think you want to talk to my Uncle Harrison. He's the executor." "Actually," Mr. Pemberton said, his tone becoming more serious, "I want to talk specifically to you. Could you come to my office tomorrow morning? Say 10 o'clock. I agreed, though I couldn't imagine what Beatrice's lawyer could possibly want with me. As far as I knew, I wasn't mentioned in her will. I had never been her favorite, never competed for her attention, never expected anything from her estate. I assumed she had left everything to Harrison, or perhaps divided it among the cousins who had spent years performing for her approval. That night, I lay in my small apartment in the Arts District, staring at the ceiling and replaying the day's events. My cat, Fitzgerald, sensed my restlessness and curled up on my chest, purring in the way that cats do when they're trying to comfort their humans. I kept thinking about the eulogy, about the lies I had told, about the way people had responded to this fictional version of my grandmother. I felt guilty about the deception. In my work as a social worker, I dealt with truth every day, ugly, complicated, difficult truth about families that didn't function, about children who weren't safe, about systems that failed the people who needed them most. I had built my professional life on the foundation of honest assessment and authentic communication. And here I had stood in front of a room full of people and painted a portrait of a woman who had never existed. But I also felt something else, a strange sense of peace. For once in my life, I had chosen kindness over honesty, compassion over accuracy. I had given Beatrice something she had never given anyone else, the presumption of good intentions. The next morning, I arrived at Pemberton, Matthews and Associates at exactly 10 o'clock. The law office was everything you'd expect from someone who handled the affairs of wealthy clients: mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, Persian rugs, and an atmosphere of quiet, expensive authority. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and a demeanor that suggested she had been managing important people's appointments for decades, smiled at me with professional warmth. "Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Pemberton is expecting you." His office was impressive in the way that lawyers' offices are supposed to be impressive: floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk that could have doubled as a small aircraft carrier, and windows that offered a view of the city's historic district. Mr. Pemberton greeted me warmly and gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Ms. Rodriguez," he began, settling into his own chair with the practiced ease of someone who delivered life-changing news on a regular basis, "I have some rather unusual news for you." "Okay," I said, not sure what to expect. "Your grandmother has left you her entire estate." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. The words seemed to hang in the air between us like smoke from a gun that had been fired in a small room. "I'm sorry, what?" "Her entire estate," he repeated, his voice taking on the careful cadence of someone who was used to people needing important information repeated. "The house on Magnolia Avenue, the investment portfolio, the bank accounts, the art collection, the jewelry, everything. It's worth approximately $3.2 million. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My vision seemed to narrow, and for a moment I thought I might actually faint. "That's impossible. She barely tolerated me. My Uncle Harrison, my Aunt Patricia, my cousins, they're the ones who competed for her attention. Yes, Mr. Pemberton interrupted gently. She was very aware of that. In fact, she was counting on it. I don't understand. Mr. Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious, almost sympathetic. Your grandmother was a very complicated woman, Ms. Rodriguez. She spent the last 25 years of her life conducting what she called character assessments on her family members. Character assessments. She wanted to see who would love her, or at least treat her with basic human decency, without the promise of financial reward. She wanted to know who would visit her, spend time with her, show her kindness even when they thought there was nothing in it for them. I thought about all those awkward Sunday afternoon visits, sitting in her formal parlor, listening to her complaints and criticisms about everything from the neighbor's barking dog to the declining state of modern society. I had never enjoyed those visits, but I had never expected anything from them either. They had felt like a duty, something you did for family, even when family made it difficult. Most of your family members, Mr. Pemberton continued, only showed interest in your grandmother when they wanted something: money for a down payment on a house, help with college tuition, assistance with business ventures, bailouts from poor financial decisions. They saw her as a bank, not as a person. But I never asked her for anything, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Exactly, Mr. Pemberton smiled. You were the only one who visited her regularly, without wanting anything in return. You were the only one who treated her like a human being rather than a potential source of income. According to her notes, you were also the only one who ever disagreed with her without trying to manipulate her. But I stopped myself, feeling disloyal even as I tried to form the words. She wasn't a nice person. No, Mr. Pemberton agreed without hesitation. She wasn't. She was difficult, demanding, often cruel, and occasionally vindictive. But she was also testing everyone around her, trying to see who would show her basic human compassion even when she didn't deserve it. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written on it in Beatrice's familiar spidery handwriting. The sight of her handwriting hit me with unexpected force. She had beautiful penmanship, the kind they don't teach anymore, all careful loops and precise slants. She left this for you, he said, placing the envelope on the desk between us, with instructions that it should only be given to you if you passed her final test. What was the final test? The eulogy, Mr. Pemberton said simply. She knew that no one in the family would want to speak at her funeral. She knew that most people would either say nothing or would struggle to find anything genuinely positive to say about her. She wanted to see if anyone would choose kindness over honesty, compassion over accuracy. I took the envelope with trembling hands, so she knew I would lie. She hoped you would choose to see the best in her, even if that best was imaginary, Mr. Pemberton said gently. She hoped that someone in her family would love her enough to give her dignity in death, even if she hadn't earned it in life. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was written in Beatrice's careful script, the same handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards and Christmas checks throughout my childhood, though those had always been signed with formal efficiency rather than warmth. My dear Alina, if you are reading this, it means you have passed my final test. It means you chose to speak kindly of me at my funeral, even though I gave you very little reason to do so during my lifetime. I know I was not an easy woman to love. I know I was often cruel, manipulative, and demanding. I know I hurt people, including you, with my words and my actions. I know I damaged relationships and crushed spirits and made family gatherings feel more like military campaigns than celebrations. But I want you to understand why. When I was young, younger than you are now, I learned that people would take advantage of kindness. My first husband, whom you never knew, taught me that love could be weaponized, that generosity was often seen as weakness, that trust was frequently betrayed, and that love was something that could be withdrawn without warning when it was no longer convenient. After he left me for his secretary, taking half of everything I had worked for and most of my ability to trust, I built walls around my heart. I decided that if I was going to be hurt, at least I would control the circumstances. I would test everyone who tried to get close to me. I would make them prove their intentions before I allowed myself to become vulnerable. I tested your Uncle Harrison by criticizing his business decisions to see if he would still visit me when I wasn't supportive. He failed, choosing to stay away rather than deal with my disapproval. I tested your Aunt Patricia by refusing to help with her children's college expenses to see if she would still call me when I wasn't useful. She failed, reducing her contact to holiday obligations and emergency requests for money. I tested your cousins in dozens of small ways, watching to see who would maintain relationships with me when there was no obvious benefit to themselves. They all failed, treating me like an investment that required careful management rather than a person who might need companionship. But you, Alina, you never failed. You visited me even when I was difficult. You listened to my complaints without trying to redirect the conversation to your own needs. You disagreed with me when you thought I was wrong, but you did it with respect rather than manipulation. You treated me with basic human dignity, even when I didn't treat you the same way. I know you probably think I didn't notice your kindness, but I did. Every visit, every patient conversation, every moment you chose to spend with a bitter old woman who had very little to offer in return, I noticed all of it. I kept track of every birthday you remembered, every holiday you included me in, every time you asked about my health or my opinions without having an ulterior motive. The money I'm leaving you is not a reward for being my favorite granddaughter. It's a recognition of your character. You showed me compassion when I didn't deserve it, and that is the rarest and most valuable quality a person can possess. I hope you will use this inheritance to build a life that makes you happy. I hope you will be kinder to others than I was, and I hope you will remember that sometimes the people who are hardest to love are the ones who need love the most. I also hope you will understand that my cruelty was never really about you, or your cousins, or even your parents. It was about my own fear and my own pain, and my complete inability to risk being hurt again. I know this doesn't excuse my behavior, but I hope it might help you understand it. Thank you for seeing something good in me, even when it wasn't there. Thank you for treating me like a person worth knowing, even when I gave you no reason to believe it. Thank you for passing a test that I should never have needed to give. With all my love and respect, emotions I was too afraid to show you while I was alive. Your grandmother, Beatrice. P.S. I hope the stories you told at my funeral someday become true of someone else. You have the gift of seeing people as they could be rather than as they are. Don't let the world take that away from you. I read the letter twice, then a third time, tears blurring my vision with each pass. When I finally looked up, Mr. Pemberton was watching me with a gentle expression that suggested he had witnessed this scene before. She wasn't testing you to be cruel, he said quietly. She was testing you because she had been hurt so many times that she had forgotten how to trust, but she never forgot how to recognize genuine kindness when she saw it. I feel terrible, I said, my voice thick with tears I hadn't expected. All those years, I thought she was just a bitter old woman. I never realized she was lonely. She was both, Mr. Pemberton said, bitter and lonely, but she was also observant and in her own way wise. She knew that true character is revealed not in how we treat those who can reward us, but in how we treat those who can't. What about my uncle, my aunt, my cousins? They're going to be devastated and angry. Mr. Pemberton's expression became more serious. Your grandmother was aware of that possibility. She left them each a sum of $50,000, enough to be meaningful, not enough to be life-changing. She also left detailed letters explaining her decision. Whether they choose to understand her reasoning or not is up to them. I left the lawyer's office that day with a cashier's check for more money than I had ever imagined possessing and a completely different understanding of my grandmother. She had been difficult, yes, but she had also been human. She had been cruel, but she had also been testing the world to see if anyone would choose kindness over self-interest. Over the next few weeks, as I processed the inheritance and the revelation about my grandmother's true nature, I found myself thinking differently about our entire relationship. Those awkward Sunday afternoon visits that I had endured out of obligation suddenly took on new meaning. I hadn't been wasting my time listening to a bitter old woman complain about the world. I had been providing companionship to someone who was desperately lonely, but too proud and too afraid to admit it. I also started to understand some of her behavior that had always puzzled me. The way she would sometimes ask me the same questions over and over again, as if she was testing my patience or my memory. The way she would make cutting remarks about other family members, as if she was trying to see if I would join in or defend them. The way she would sometimes just sit in silence for long stretches, as if she was waiting to see if I would stay or make an excuse to leave. She had been conducting a decades-long experiment in human nature, and I had been her unwitting test subject. The thought was both flattering and deeply sad. The hardest part was realizing how isolated she must have felt. Here was a woman with millions of dollars, a beautiful house filled with expensive things, and a large family. But she had been so afraid of being used that she had pushed everyone away. Everyone except me, and only because I had been too indifferent to her money to bother trying to manipulate her. I thought about calling my Uncle Harrison or my Aunt Patricia to tell them about the inheritance, but something held me back. They had spent years competing for Beatrice's approval, performing elaborate shows of affection whenever they thought it might benefit them financially. How would they react to learning that the granddaughter who had never tried to win her favor was the one who had actually won it? Instead, I decided to keep the inheritance private, at least for now. I used some of the money to pay off my student loans and buy a small house in the historic district. Nothing too flashy, just a modest craftsman bungalow with a garden where I could try my hand at growing the roses that Beatrice had supposedly loved. I was careful not to make any dramatic changes to my lifestyle that might raise questions about my sudden financial freedom. The most profound change wasn't financial, it was emotional. I found myself thinking about other people in my life who might be difficult or demanding, wondering if their behavior was a defense mechanism rather than their true nature. I became more patient with my clients at work, more understanding with difficult colleagues, more willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. In my job as a social worker, I encountered people every day who had been hurt by the world in ways that made them defensive, angry, or withdrawn. I had always tried to approach them with compassion, but now I had a deeper understanding of how pain could manifest as cruelty, how fear could disguise itself as strength. I started volunteering at a senior center, spending time with elderly people who reminded me of Beatrice, sharp-tongued, demanding, critical of everything around them. But now I could see past the surface complaints to the loneliness underneath. I could recognize the testing behavior for what it was, a desperate attempt to see if anyone would stay when staying became difficult. 6 months after the funeral, I was cleaning out my grandmother's house, my house now, when I found something that brought everything full circle. Hidden in her bedroom closet, behind a row of formal dresses she rarely wore, was a collection of scrapbooks. They were filled with things I had never known she had kept. Report cards from my elementary school years, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Newspaper clippings from when I had won awards for my volunteer work in college. Programs from my graduation ceremony, which I didn't even remember her attending. Photos of me at various family gatherings, carefully cut out and pasted in with little handwritten captions. Alina at Christmas, age 16, such a thoughtful expression. Alina helping in the kitchen, always willing to help. Alina reading to little Marcus, born teacher. She had been paying attention all along. While I thought she barely noticed me, she had been documenting my life like a proud grandmother who was too afraid to show her feelings directly. The final scrapbook was the most surprising. It was filled entirely with things related to my career as a social worker. Articles I had written for professional journals about working with traumatized children. Thank you letters from families I had helped. Citations from my supervisors. A newspaper article about a program I had developed to help aging-out foster children transition to independent living. Under each item, she had written notes in her careful handwriting. Alina's article about childhood trauma. She understands pain. Thank you letter from the Morrison family. Alina helped them keep their children. Alina's innovative program. She's making a real difference. On the last page of the final scrapbook was a photo I had never seen before. It was a picture of me and Beatrice from my college graduation party, sitting together in her garden. I was showing her something, probably my diploma, and she was leaning in close, actually smiling. Not the tight, social smile she wore for photographs, but a genuine expression of warmth and pride. I had no memory of this moment, but someone had captured it, and she had treasured it enough to put it in her secret collection. Under the photo, in her careful handwriting, she had written, My dear Alina, the only one who sees me as a person, not an ATM. I hope someday she understands how much her visits mean to me. I wish I were brave enough to tell her. I sat on the floor of her closet, surrounded by the evidence of a love I had never known existed, and I cried. Not for the bitter, difficult woman I had thought she was, but for the lonely, frightened woman she had actually been. A woman who had been so afraid of being hurt that she had hidden her love behind walls of cruelty and tests of character. The eulogy I had given at her funeral, the beautiful lies I had told about her kindness and wisdom, suddenly didn't feel like lies anymore. They felt like prophecy. They were the truth about who she could have been, who she wanted to be, if she hadn't been so afraid. As I continued going through her things, I found more evidence of the person she had hidden from the world. Receipts for anonymous donations to various charities, including the Children's Services Department where I worked. A safe deposit box key that led to a collection of bonds and stocks, all designated for a scholarship fund she had apparently been funding for years. A scholarship for children aging out of foster care who wanted to pursue careers in social work. There were letters she had written but never sent, apologies to family members she had hurt, explanations of behavior she couldn't justify, but wanted them to understand. A letter to my cousin Marcus, apologizing for the way she had mocked his stuttering and explaining how his gentle nature had reminded her of her own father, who had been killed in a car accident when she was 12. A letter to my cousin Isabella, acknowledging that her criticism of Isabella's career choice had come from her own regret at never pursuing her childhood dream of becoming a teacher. A letter to my sister Jasmine that made me cry all over again. In it, Beatrice apologized for the comments about her weight and appearance, explaining that she had seen so much of her own teenage self in Jasmine, the insecurity, the desperate need for approval, the tendency to seek love in all the wrong places, that she had tried to toughen her up before the world could hurt her worse. It was a misguided attempt at protection that had caused the very harm she had been trying to prevent. But the most revealing letter was one addressed to herself, apparently written as a kind of self-examination. Dear Beatrice, you are 78 years old and you are dying. Not today, maybe not this year, but soon enough. And what do you have to show for all your wealth, all your testing, all your careful guarding of your heart? You have a granddaughter who visits you out of duty rather than love, because you have been too afraid to show her that she means the world to you. You have family members who see you as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to know, because you have made yourself unknowable. You have acquaintances who respect your money but not your character, because you have hidden your character behind walls of cruelty and manipulation. You have become the very thing you were trying to protect yourself from, a person who uses others, who causes pain, who leaves people feeling smaller than they were before they met you. The girl who married Thomas 50 years ago would not recognize the woman you have become. She would be ashamed of your cruelty, your manipulation, your willingness to hurt others to protect yourself from hurt. It is not too late to change. It is not too late to show Alina and the others who you really are. But it would require courage you're not sure you possess. The courage to risk being hurt again, the courage to admit you were wrong, the courage to love without guarantees. You may not have that courage while you're alive, but perhaps you can find it in death. Perhaps you can finally tell the truth about who you were and who you wanted to be. The eulogy will be your final test, not of them, but of yourself. Will you find someone who will choose to see the good in you even when it's not there? Will someone love you enough to lie for you, to give you in death the dignity you never allowed yourself in life? You hope it will be Elena. She is the only one who has shown you consistent kindness without expecting anything in return. If anyone will choose compassion over honesty, it will be her. And if she doesn't, if no one is willing to speak well of you at your funeral, then you will have gotten exactly what you deserved, and perhaps that will be a kind of justice too. Reading this letter felt like discovering a completely different person had been living inside my grandmother's skin. The self-awareness, the regret, the longing for connection. It was all there, hidden beneath layers of defensive cruelty and manipulative behavior. I spent the next several hours going through the rest of her papers, finding more evidence of the complex, contradictory person she had been. There were journals dating back decades, chronicling her internal battles between the desire to connect with people and the fear of being hurt again. There were drafts of letters she had considered sending to family members, apologizing for specific incidents, trying to explain her behavior without excusing it. There was even a draft of a letter to me, written just a few months before her death. Dear Alina, I know you think I don't appreciate your visits, but you are wrong. Your visits are the highlight of my week. When you sit in my parlor and listen to my complaints, when you disagree with me respectfully, when you treat me like a person rather than a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited, you give me something I haven't had in years, the feeling of being seen. I know I am difficult. I know I am often cruel. I know I have hurt you and others with my words and my actions. I wish I could explain why without sounding like I am making excuses. When I was young, I believed that love was something you could count on, something that would protect you from the world's cruelties. I learned the hard way that love can be taken away without warning, that the people you trust most can become the people who hurt you worst. So I built walls. I tested everyone who tried to get close to me. I pushed people away before they could leave me. I became the person who caused pain instead of the person who received it. But you, Alina, you never tried to hurt me back. You never joined in when I criticized others. You never tried to manipulate me or use me. You just sat with me and listened, even when what I was saying was bitter or unfair. I wish I could tell you this in person, but I am too much of a coward. I am afraid that if I show you how much you mean to me, you will use that knowledge to hurt me, even though you have never shown any inclination to do so. I am leaving you everything in my will, not because you asked for it, but because you never did. I am leaving it to you because you have shown me the kind of person I wish I had been, someone who chooses kindness over self-protection, compassion over cynicism. I hope you will understand that my cruelty was never really about you. It was about my own fear and my own inability to risk being vulnerable again. I hope you will forgive an old woman who was too afraid to love openly and too proud to admit her mistakes while she was still alive to make amends. You are the best of all of us, Alina. Don't let the world change that. With all the love I was too afraid to show. Grandmother. This letter, like the others, had never been sent. It was dated just 2 weeks before her death, suggesting she had been struggling with whether to mail it right up until the end. As I sat surrounded by these revelations, I began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Beatrice hadn't just been testing our characters. She had been documenting them, studying us, trying to understand what made people kind or cruel, generous or selfish. She had been conducting a lifelong study of human nature, using her own family as unwitting subjects. And in the end, she had concluded that I was the only one who had passed her tests consistently, not because I was trying to pass them, but because I wasn't trying at all. I had simply treated her with basic human decency, because that was who I was, not because of who she was or what she might do for me. The irony was overwhelming. In trying to protect herself from being used, she had turned herself into someone who used others. In trying to find genuine love, she had created conditions that made genuine love nearly impossible. But somehow, through all of that dysfunction and manipulation, she had managed to recognize authentic kindness when she saw it. A year later, I was still processing everything I had learned about my grandmother. I had used part of the inheritance to buy a larger house with room for foster children, teenagers who were aging out of the system, and needed a safe place to transition to independence. It seemed like something Beatrice would have approved of, given her secret scholarship fund. I had also established a foundation in her memory. Not the Beatrice Montgomery Foundation for the Arts or the Beatrice Montgomery Scholarship Fund that might have appealed to her vanity, but the Second Chances Foundation, dedicated to helping elderly people who had become isolated due to difficult personalities or strained family relationships. The foundation sponsored programs that paired volunteers with elderly people who had been written off as difficult or impossible. The volunteers were trained to look past defensive behaviors and testing patterns to see the lonely, frightened people underneath. It was inspired by my own experience with Beatrice, but also by the dozens of similar cases I encountered in my work. I never told the rest of my family about the inheritance. Let them think that Beatrice's money had gone to charity, as Mr. Pemberton had suggested it would if no one had passed her final test. In a way, it had gone to charity, It had gone to someone who had learned to see past the surface of difficult people and recognize the humanity underneath. My Uncle Harrison and Aunt Patricia had been predictably upset about their modest bequests, especially when they learned about the conditions Beatrice had imposed. The letters she had left for them explained her reasoning, but I doubted they would ever truly understand or accept it. They had spent so many years seeing her as an obstacle to overcome that they couldn't conceive of her as a person who might have needed love and companionship. My cousins had reacted with varying degrees of anger, confusion, and grudging acceptance. Marcus had surprised everyone by being the most understanding, perhaps because his own struggles with confidence had given him insight into defensive behavior. Isabella had been hurt and angry at first, but had eventually come around to a grudging respect for Beatrice's methodology, if not her conclusions. My sister Jasmine had been the most affected by Beatrice's posthumous letter. Learning that her grandmother's cruelty had come from a misguided attempt at protection, rather than genuine malice, had helped her process some of her own struggles with self-esteem and body image. She had started therapy and was working through the damage that years of criticism had done to her self-concept. Sometimes I still visited Beatrice's grave, my grandmother's grave, bringing flowers and sitting quietly beside her headstone. I would tell her about the foundation, about the foster children living in her house, about the small acts of kindness I tried to perform in her memory. I would tell her about the elderly clients I worked with who reminded me of her, sharp-tongued, demanding, critical of everything around them, but desperately lonely underneath. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the light fell across her headstone in a particular way, I swear I could hear her voice. Not the sharp, critical voice I remembered from her lifetime, but a softer voice, warm with gratitude and love. Thank you for seeing something good in me, even when it wasn't there. The truth was, it had been there all along. It had just been hidden behind years of hurt and fear, and the desperate need to protect a heart that had been broken too many times. My grandmother's greatest gift to me wasn't the money she left behind, it was the understanding that everyone, even the most difficult people, deserves to be seen with compassionate eyes. Her final test wasn't really about whether I could lie convincingly at her funeral. It was about whether I could choose love over judgment, kindness over honesty, hope over cynicism. And in passing that test, I hadn't just inherited her money. I had inherited her wisdom, her pain, and ultimately her capacity for love. The cruel grandmother, who had made my childhood difficult, was gone. But the woman who had secretly cherished every moment of connection, who had documented my life with the devotion of someone who truly cared, who had spent her final years hoping that someone would see past her defenses to the lonely person inside. That woman lived on in every act of kindness I chose to perform, every moment of patience I offered to difficult people, every time I chose to see the best in someone who hadn't earned it. Beatrice Montgomery had been a master teacher after all. She had just been teaching a lesson that took me 31 years to understand. That love doesn't always look like love, that pain often disguises itself as cruelty, and that sometimes the people who need compassion most are the ones who make it hardest to give. In the end, the beautiful lies I told at her funeral became a kind of truth, not about who she had been, but about who she could have been if she hadn't been so afraid. And maybe that's what love really is, seeing people not just as they are, but as they could be, and choosing to believe in their potential for goodness even when they can't see it themselves. The inheritance was significant, but the real legacy she left me was far more valuable. The understanding that kindness is always a choice, compassion is always possible, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is choose to love the unlovable, help the difficult, and see the humanity in those who have forgotten how to show it. What an absolutely incredible story about the power of compassion and the complexity of human nature. Beatrice's final test shows us that sometimes the people who seem the most unlovable are the ones who need love the most. What do you think about Alina's choice to lie in the eulogy? Have you ever discovered that someone difficult in your life was actually testing your character? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this powerful story of hidden love and unexpected inheritance, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories every day. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.